Welcome to the Agile Wire. Brought to you by Wisconsin Agility. We want you to get agile and stay agile. Now here are your hosts, Jeff Bubolz and Chad Beier. And we're recording. All right, kick us off, Jeff.
All right, we got Jim Highsmith joining us on the podcast today. Jim's one of the co-authors of the Agile Manifesto. He's been doing this for many years, and he's got a new book out called The Wild West to Agile, The Adventures in Software Development, Evolutions, and Revolutions. So we're going to dive into the book, Jim, but the one question that, I'm kind of dying to know is really about the Agile name. So I've heard this story and things get twisted. I know it was 20 years ago. I can't remember what happened 20 years ago in a conversation or a vacation, but the phrase I remember somebody telling me one time is that the reason we didn't pick a different word instead of agile was we were thinking about adaptive as maybe one of the words is because we didn't pick that because Jim would have got all the business. Because you had a book out with that word, you had different things out that, your consulting company had that word in it. People were like, yeah, Jim's going to steal all the business. We got to pick a different word. Is that true, or is that just folklore at this point?
Well, as you say, things get twisted around. And what happened was, after we'd done some initial going around the room, and I can talk about that later, one of the things we wanted to do was to pick what we're going to call ourselves. And because Alistair Coburn in particular didn't like being called a lightweight methodologist. Mm-hmm. And so we went around, and as far as I can remember, we put 15 or 20 words up on the board. And agile was one of them, adaptive was one of them, flexible was one of them. There are a number of words like that. And I guess lightweight, I'm not sure if it made it or not. And then we started eliminating. And we whittled them down. We liked this one, or we didn't like this one for a particular reason, and we take that off the board. And I actually took adaptive off the board myself, because I said we shouldn't have a name for something that reflects that's the same as somebody has on their methodology. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm not sure at what point I did it, but and that actually reflected, I think, the part of the aura of that particular meeting is that we were both competitors and we were collaboration. And for that particular meeting, the collaboration won out. And we all went off and were more competitors. But even then, we did a lot of working together on things. And so there was a word that was thrown around a lot more during that period of time, which was coopetition. Yep. We both cooperated and we competed. Yeah. And both of those things are important. And that meeting was more of a collaboration.
Yeah. That's awesome.
That's funny. We use that same word. So Chad and I are both professional Scrum trainers at scrum.org. And we use the same thing because we're all as PSTs, professional Scrum trainers. We're separate companies, separate, entities. But we all come together to work on building that community and, right, staying in sync and helping each other out. So it's a lot of co-opetition. We are competitors, but we also help each other, and collaborate.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of the Agile movement. Actually, there's another movement that did a lot of the same things. It was interesting. I read this in Walter Isaacson's book on the development of the not stem cell, but of the gene splicing. I'm sorry, gene splicing.
Okay.
And that there was a bunch of scientists who collaborated intensely on that gene splicing science, which enabled us to do, or enabled them to do, the COVID vaccine so quickly.
Yeah.
So if they hadn't cooperated, it wouldn't have done that. At the same time, they were all rushing to publish before the other one.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat of the same kind of collaboration, but also competition. Of course, the money was a lot more important during that one because there was big pharma was in it. For
sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because we remind ourselves, so Jeff and I are also business partners, and sometimes that scarcity principle, mindset kicks in your gut, and you feel well, wait, but if I help this person, there's not enough business to go around, and you have to right, take that little demon off your shoulder and brush it away, because if you slow your brain down and think about it, it's no, if we enrich the community, it's good for everybody. And you know it. After you think about it and pause, you know it.
Right.
But sometimes, right, that kind of fight or flight response kicks in and you're like, oh, if I share these secrets with this other consultancy. So it's funny. We get challenged, I think, like Jeff said, all the time in the scrum.org community because we are competitors, but we're collaborators. And so it is that, I mean, that word coopetition has been thrown around, you know, in our circles as well. So,
yeah. And one of the things, you know, during the manifesto meeting, we actually talked about the fact that hopefully what would happen is we would grow the pie so that everybody got a bigger slice, you know, after the fact. So rather than have a small market.
Yep.
And have a bigger slice of a small market, have a bigger market, and each have a slice of it, and that's really what happened. All as you well know, the Scrum folks got the biggest slice, but
yeah, for sure.
There's plenty of room for other folks.
Yeah, we tend to always quote, you know, the loose somewhere between 80 and 90% of all things Agile. Like someone's gonna use a Scrum term at some point. Like it just, you know, it really took off like crazy. All right, I have one more question. We don't have to sit here and talk about the manifesto meeting forever, but I have a question too. I was joking with Jeff. Like, did you guys actually ski? Like, did everybody ski?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Alistair and I skied, and Martin skied, and I don't remember who else, but I know at least the three of us skied.
Right, awesome.
And I've actually got a picture of Alistair and I on top of a ski lift.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's awesome. No, I always think, you know, we're trainers, so we tell the story a lot, but we weren't there. It's always just, again, what you've read in books. And so whenever we tell the story, it's always funny when you're introducing someone to the Agile Manifesto. You're like, and so they met in Snowbird, Utah for, you know, on a ski hill. And it's just like, it's such an odd story to tell people. They're kind of like, really?
And you know, at this point in time, we are dealing with people's memories that are 20 plus years old. And so there was a meeting before the Agile meeting. It was basically an XP meeting with Kent Beck puts together.
Yeah.
And I could have sworn that Alistair was there because I actually wrote it in my draft of the book that Alistair attended that meeting. And when Alistair read that in the draft of the book, he said, no, I wasn't there.
Yep. Yeah, it's, I applaud you for being able to remember what you have in here, because it's so we just read your you know, Jeff and I always like to prep and read the books that come out whenever we have someone on the podcast. So we did read the book, and yeah, you got a lot of stories in here. Like, it's just remembering all the details from, you know, the number of client engagements. I mean, I think back to 3 years ago, even a year ago at a client engagement, and I'm like, it starts to get fuzzy. So your memory's probably better than mine. I don't know.
Some things come better than others.
Yeah, well, you know, probably the things that leave those impressions, I would imagine. You know, I have a question.
Yeah, and it's also since the advent of the computer, right, and the use of personal computers in the mid-90s, I can go back and find a lot of documents and emails that I don't have for prior eras.
Yep.
And so my memory was enhanced by having that documentation.
Yeah.
Sure.
That said, I can't remember anyone's phone number anymore, and I used to be able to, but I just rely on the phone to remember it for me, right? So whether that's good or bad for our brains, I'm not sure, but I do rely a lot on the digital world to be an extension of my brain because I know I don't have to hold it all. But anyway, I got a question. I tried to mark up the book. I always like to mark up books for the things that really speak to me from relating to it. And you know, Jeff and I, like the nice thing about being a business owner, right? You can give yourself your own job title. And we've really gravitated towards organizational agility advisor. And we've for years now, we've chosen that word agility very deliberately because of what's happened to the word agile. And it's become ubiquitous around the world, right? But it's also been watered down a lot. And I love that you speak to that in the book about how agile and agility are different, right? And you speak to how one being more of a mindset versus just the methods and methodologies. But there's also another passage that really spoke to me where you say, and I'm just going to maybe read the quote, but when you're talking about agile transformation, right? Because we talk about this all the time. Well, transformation implies that there's an end state, and you state it exactly that way, right? And you say a better descriptor for this evolution is transforming as a verb rather than transformation because, again, it implies an end state without that action to it. And I love that, right? Like the note I added to it is like, maybe just call it like agile improvement. Because like, if we're all being honest with ourselves and we're checking our egos at the door, you can't stop improving. Whether you're an individual, a team, or a business, right? You have to continuously improve. So I don't know. I really like that passage. I can't remember what part of the book it was. But
right. To me, the word agile implies continuous improvement.
Yeah.
That it's part of the word. And one of the things we could talk about a little bit later, but I've called some of the things that I see today prescriptive agility.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense, right? As opposed to adaptive agility. But it's the difference between how you look at methodology. And I've been in the methodology business for many, many years now. And I see something I would call a prescriptive methodology, and I see something I call a generative methodology. And a generative methodology starts small, and you add to it as you need to add things. Whereas a prescriptive methodology says, do all these things, and you'll come out ahead. And there's a nascent movement going on now that I'm sort of pushing too, which basically says, let's go back to the basics.
Yep.
And then extend from there into new areas. But let's not lose track of the fact that the basics have to do with agility more than any particular agile methodology.
Yeah.
Yep. We were just having a conversation earlier today about somebody who was struggling with using AI and like, how do we do this? And they're like, it's the same thing when we went to the cloud. Like, we just need a cross-functional team and give them focus and order a list and like have them start working on something and deliver frequently. Like, it's not that hard. Like, we don't need a separate AI department. Like, I don't know. So they are the foundations, right? Like, without the good foundation, like, it's going to be the same problems we've experienced, for decades.
Yeah. Well, Alistair has something he calls Shu Ha Ri, which is basically beginners, practitioners, and experts in terms of any particular methodology or practice or method. And so, and having a prescription at level one, at the entry level learning, is not necessarily a bad thing. But if you don't learn the mindset behind those, then it's very difficult to advance to the next level. And surely you can't get to be an expert and still think it's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
I remember somebody asking Ron Jeffries one time, who's one of the XP gurus, and this was in a conference, and Ron was asked, if I do all the 12 practices, am I really an XPer? And Ron said, well, I don't know anymore. He said, I use some of the practices sometimes, I use other practices other times. It kind of depends on the situation. And I thought that was a great answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so somebody's new to this, right? Like, new to anything agile. They're coming into, because I'm surprised, like, right? It's been decades now, and there's so many new people that are coming into this. And they're hearing the story, then maybe they're going back and reading it. We're talking about foundations here. Like, what would be like your one piece of advice for somebody who's brand new, kind of like starting off in anything in the agile space? Would it be just to pick one of the methodologies, one of the frameworks, and like just really get into the foundations, or would it be something else?
Well, I think that definitely be part of it. I think that it's interesting. One of the things I've learned is that there are a whole bunch of people out there who are trying to do agile who have never heard of the Manifesto. So one of the things I would say is go back to the foundational values and principles and at least read through them. And it's interesting to me that you say, and I've heard this other places, that there are a lot of people new to Agile. I had a call from a big company on the West Coast in about 2010, and they said, we'd like to get involved in Agile. And I said, where have you been for 10 years? Now I can say, where have you been for 22 years?
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, I was talking to some people from the Agile Alliance not long ago, and the bulk of those people that come to the Agile Alliance conferences are newbies. 75% maybe.
Yep.
It'll be very interesting to me. I'm going to the conference in Orlando next week, and it'll be the first Agile conference I've gone to in probably 10 years. So it'll be great to kind of go and see what's happened in the last 10 years and meet some of the new people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I would like to think that, fast forward another decade into the future, and maybe at the 30-year mark, that everyone has heard of it. But you know what? I don't think it's going to be the case. Like, I think there are going to be companies a decade from now discovering it. And maybe they know of it, right? But their organization still hasn't made any significant leap. And we might be biased.
And my contention is that they probably won't be around.
Yeah. We keep saying that same thing, but we might be biased because we're in the Midwest. So we might not be as bleeding edge as some of the Silicon Valley companies, right? I also think we have a lot of insurance companies in the Midwest. I always like to joke it was a bunch of farmers getting together and we're like, we got to pool our resources and, reduce risk. And they all started insurance companies. And of course, they're so risk averse because they're insurance companies with all these roots that like the change part is hard. But
let's look at it, because I was thinking about insurance companies the other day. So there was a big thing in the newspaper, in the news recently about the number of insurance companies that are pulling out of Florida.
Okay.
Because of the high cost. We had a big forest fire out here 2 years ago that destroyed 1,000 houses in a very upscale area around Boulder. And the floods and the snow in the West Coast. The Alta ski area in Utah this year had 903 inches of snow.
Wow.
That's 75 feet of snow.
Wow.
And insurance companies are in for a huge surprise.
Yep.
They shouldn't be, but they're going to have to move and adapt fairly quickly because we're looking at an entirely different era of climate change, and I think it's coming on us a hell of a lot faster than we anticipated. And so I think this is going to happen for a lot of companies. By the time you take climate change, the geopolitical situation, COVID, economic change, and you meld all those things together, what comes out is unknown and unknowable. And the only way you can do something about that is to prepare and go the next step in agility, which you all call organizational agility, and I'll just refer to as business agility. Yep. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the next step. And if companies don't go there, they're going to get progressively left behind.
Yeah, I mean, I love
black swan events will come and they'll knock out those companies, right? So it's probably those big things that will be the disruptors, and the companies that can handle them, respond, will take advantage of them. Yeah, that's a good point. It'll be interesting. People have short memories though too. So like if they go down this path, this urgent thing happens, this emergency happens, they rally around this thing, and then they work in a certain way. They create the cross-functional team. They get the right people in the room. They give them focus, and then we go back to normal times, and all of a sudden, we just like do the opposite thing. And so like, I don't know. We'll see. I don't know. I'm hopeful that you're right, Jim, but I think we might also shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit.
But I also think one of the key ingredients, and I talk about this in the book when I talk about the things that I did work-wise and the things that I did adventure-wise, mountaineering and rock climbing and all that kind of stuff. I think you need people, catalysts in organizations that have that adventurous spirit, that are willing to take chances. And you can't just have one or two at the bottom or one or two at the top. You've got to have people like that at every level. So one of the things I would advise leaders to do if you're going to make an agile transformation is you better find some of those adventurous people at every level that you're trying to change and engage them. I did a very large agile transition one time for a company, and then we left, and about 6 months after we left, I found out that they put a manager in charge of the continuing agile transition who was a micromanager.
Yep.
And I'm thinking, they didn't get the whole message.
Yep. So you talk in I think it's towards the end of the book where you talk about courageous executives are kind of like the next thing that's going to disrupt organizations. Is that kind of what you meant when you're talking about courageous leaders at different levels? And can you just expand on that a little bit more, what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I used the courageous executives as the name for the second era because I felt that in the early Agile years, it was more of a team-focused transition. You know, you worked on this team here or this team there in an organization, but there really wasn't much spreading throughout the organization. And then about 2004, 2005, we began to get heads of development, IT directors, CIOs, VPs of engineering coming to us and saying, we want to impact the whole organization. We want to change and bring Agile into the whole organization. And that really took a lot of courage and risk-taking at that level, particularly if they really bought into it. So, for example, SciEx, the company whose story I talk about in the book, their executive, they had an IT manager and they had a product director. And after we worked on the software side of that company for about a year and a half, the product director says, we're going to do the next version of our medical instrument using Agile. And we put everybody in a room and we basically worked, and that was a hardware and software gig. And that was a huge challenge and a huge courage by this guy. So part of that courage is kind of adventurous, being willing to take that step and risk some things. And one of the things, in kind of an analogy to mountaineering, is you don't learn about how to mitigate risk until you actually do it. And you can read all these books about weather conditions and ice conditions and rock conditions, but until you get there, until you've had to make a decision, do I go on or do I go back? You know, it's lightning and thundering, and I better get off this damn mountain pretty quick. Yep. and you learn from that experience, and you have to do the same thing as you're making some transitions, be they Agile or other kinds of transitions. You learn from taking smaller steps. You don't want to take a huge step, although sometimes you have to do that.
Yeah. I mean, so we're always nudging our clients to act in the moment and look for those micro changes, because if everybody does that, then you can, whether it's grassroots or not, you can make a lot of change happen, even with large organizational impediments. I used to have a talk called a Boat Rocker's Toolkit, and I basically always refer to myself when I'm telling stories about my past as like a boat rocker. Like, I like to rock the boat, like if you're in a canoe, to give everyone that slightly uneasy feeling, like, hey, I'm challenging the status quo. And we just taught a class this week with some a younger audience, like people in a program.
Just out of high school.
Yeah, just out of high school. And we're teaching them Scrum. And they were asking for advice. And I was like, just don't stop challenging the status quo. I was kind of like, back to your adventure, like, go out and change things. Like, do not accept your organization's current state as okay. Like, so your passage in here, it's so funny. When I used to work at a Fortune 500, and I was part of a PMO at the time, but we were like spinning up Agile stuff in stealth mode. And we were essentially like trying to deconstruct our project management office from the inside out. And it was a very crazy time, because we were like kind of putting ourselves out of jobs, but we were also reshaping what we were doing. Anyway, some of my PM colleagues, they would joke about how I was Don Quixote and I was tilting at these windmills. And I was reading your book, and then you referenced from one of your 2002 books, right? Like this passage where you talk about that. So then I was like, okay, is this coincidence? Or maybe what happened is my colleagues read your book, and then they were like, hey, this is Chad. But anyway, it's funny that they used to basically always, call me Don Quixote, and my manager's like, Chad, you got to pick your battles. And I'd be like, I want to pick all of them. Like, I'm going to tilt at every windmill. So I don't know. Not everybody has that, I guess, throughout the organization. But I totally agree. Like, the more you can build sort of a group of people who are passionate about making those small changes, I think it makes working in those organizations more exciting as an employee. And whether the organization knows it or not, you're helping them, right?
Right.
They might not see it that way initially, but I love it. I think we need more change agents and people willing to challenge the status quo. And hopefully we have leaders, courageous leaders, more of them in the future, who actually lead the way on that, right? They encourage everyone to challenge the status quo. Because if you're not, again, you have an ego problem or you have a blind spot. Like staying still from 2023 and beyond, and whatever year it is, we can just say that year and say beyond, you have to be changing, right?
Yep.
All right. So in your book, Jim, you talk a lot about, the past, before Agile, the last 23 years. But now, what's the future? So if you had to answer the question, the future of Agile is, how would you answer that question?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I've got more than once, as you might imagine. Like, what's AI going to do? And when I started writing the last chapter of the book, I started thinking about, well, maybe I ought to try to do some predicting. And then I thought, well, with everything that's changing, that's probably not going to work out very well for me in the long run. And so I really looked at this as what I intended to do with that book is to help people prepare for the future. That history isn't, you don't look at history in order to predict the future, but in order to prepare for the future. And so that, if you look at the future and you think it's going to be very disruptive and disrupted, and the speed of change is going to increase, I've been using recently a kind of a clock going around as the rate of change. And in the 80s, it went like this. And in the 90s, it went like this. And in the 2000s, it went like this. And now you can't even see it spinning.
Yeah.
And that's happening quite a bit. I mean, just the thing we were talking about a little while ago, the climate changes. I think things are happening now that people weren't predicting were going to happen for 20 or 30 years. Yep. So I think this whole idea of agility is pretty important.
Yeah. I love that. That was actually one of the highlights from the book, that preparing for the future instead of predicting it. And I love it.
And I think, I thought about this a little bit the other day, and I thought about, okay, if that's true, if really I'm thinking about helping people prepare for the future, then I ought to have something to say about AI and not predict where it's going, but give people a little historical perspective. When I started working in the mid-'60s, I was in engineering school, and we built circuits with transistors that were about the big of my end of my little finger. Today, you have 5 billion transistors on a chip.
Yeah.
Back then, if you could have had a gigabyte of memory on an IBM 36040, which you couldn't, you couldn't put a gigabyte on it, it would have cost $734 million.
Yep.
Whereas it would cost $5 or $10 today. So you had an enormous change in technology. And so you might think that put a lot of people out of business. But what happened, or out of jobs, but what happened was it increased the usage areas for computers exponentially. So what happened was you actually increased the number of jobs exponentially as you went over that time. And I think what you're going to see is the same thing that happened before, which is you may have to have a different set of skills. And so you really need to think about a lifelong learning and how to do that as an individual, as in a company. And I was interested, I went to visit the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago. And there was a bonsai exhibit. And just exquisite bonsai trees in about 3 different buildings. There was a U.S. building, there was a China building, there was a Japanese building. And every one of those bonsai trees had a little label on it. In training since 1875. In training since 1654. It was incredible that to think back that these things had actually been involved for that long. But I think that's the kind of learning we're going to have to do is continual learning, because the same jobs are you won't be doing the same things. When I started, our technical layer we had two technical layers. We had an operating system and we had a compiler. That was it. And now, how many components do you have in a project? You got tons.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's awesome. So I'm a computer programmer. I'm not allowed to touch keyboards anymore, but I was exposed to some of those early languages, right? From an academic standpoint when I was in college, like assembly and Fortran and COBOL. But then my first programming class, I believe, was C++. So I was already spoiled, right? Like I was already kind of like into the object-oriented, and then I was into Java right after that. So my grandfather, I'm not going to share too much, but he used to work at Lockheed Martin in the 70s and 80s. And so he's told me some really cool stories about how, testing missiles and how their QA processes worked then, right? And I haven't written them down, so I can't remember all the details, but it sounded fascinating. And part of me being a programmer, I actually really did appreciate the history part of this book. And just, I know what a punch card is. I've heard of it, but I've never interacted with one. And I remember my grandfather telling me about very similar stories about punch cards, and we've talked about it on the phone, in the last decade or two. But so you worked. I'm long-winded sometimes. I apologize. So you worked on the Apollo missions at NASA, right? That's part of the book.
Right.
And for all the listeners, right, you can go out and read some of the cool stories that you mentioned. But what I'm dying to know for the podcast, you mentioned some cool pieces of that time. Is there any story that you didn't put in the book that you either considered or, a cool story about working on that program?
Well, this is a story not exactly working on that program, but it's a story about technology of that era. So here we are shooting off Titan rockets. And those were the ones that carried the military payloads back in those days, the military satellites. And so that's why it was at an Air Force base, because a lot of these were military-grade rockets. So in the early days, they wanted to make sure that the rocket didn't go up and head inland, that it went up and headed out towards the ocean, because they had some rockets blow up that headed inland. And that's probably not good, because Florida has residents and, those kinds of people.
Right.
And so what they did is they put an Air Force officer on one side of the missile, and he had a wooden frame with a wire running up it. And the missile needed to climb that wire and go out to the right rather than out to the left. And there's another Air Force officer 90 degrees away who had the same kind of thing. And the missile was supposed to go straight up the wire and not veer left or right.
Okay.
So that was the technology. So that we replaced that technology with a strip chart recorder. And so it was supposed to go up the strip chart recorder and go this way. The first time they used it, it went up, it went the wrong way, they blew the missile up. And they found out they'd reversed the leads on the instrument. And it was actually going in the right direction.
Oh my goodness. I mean, that's like that ones and zeros binary on off switches right there, right? Like that's like about as basic as you can get right there, right? Reversing the leads.
And before, they're just multitudes of stories that went around Cocoa Beach during that period of time. But you know what the astronauts on the Mercury program were the most concerned about in terms of their safety? Was the gantry. It was so rickety that they were afraid to ride up in the elevator of the gantry because they were sure it was going to fall down. Now, once they got on the rocket, they felt pretty good.
Oh man. Yeah, that tops that. So that's why I wanted to hear a story from you, because the stakes of that, right? What you just said, like rockets exploding inland due to such a simple thing, right? But still, yet a mistake you can make. Like, I don't know. Like, right. I'm sure you have, being a programmer, right? For many decades, you probably have all kinds of stories. I know mine probably isn't as fun, but one of my first big jobs programming was web development, and I was doing this conference registration system. Have I told this on the podcast before, Jeff?
I don't think you have.
So I was doing this, and I was new. I was very green, and it was a small company, and they kind of gave me a long leash. Like, they gave me a lot of autonomy and freedom. And so I was like working on this conference registration system, and it was for this healthcare company in California. And we were launching, and we had tested everything, and we were all set. And I'd never really coded something to interact with credit card transactions. So I think it was VeriSign that I had to interface with to get to run the cards. Anyway, I just saw the different statuses that you could do for the credit card call. And one of them was called credit. And I was like, oh yeah, credit for credit card. So I have this all coded and it's tested, and we launch and we start going live, and conference registrations start coming in, and everything's working great. And then all of a sudden the phone rings, and they're like, yeah, it's funny. Like, all the people registering for our conference, it's actually refunding them the money instead of charging them the money. And I was like we had to figure out, right away. My colleagues looked into it, and we found the issue right away. But registrations were happening, and my manager, looking back, I only realize now how cool it was. But she was like, "Okay, you made the mess. You clean it up. So here's the phone number of the client. You call the client and run damage control. Figure out how we, get the money back, charge them the right way." And it was a really good experience for me, but just, another silly mistake, right? We tested everything. I just, chose some stupid status for the credit card transaction that was actually refunded.
Yeah.
Obviously now looking back, it's like, why didn't I know that? But you just don't know what you don't know.
Well, there are tons of stories like that. I think it was in the 70s, somebody made a change to the Social Security system, which caused some differences in the checks. And they caught it right away, the fact that the wrong number was on the checks. But they had to have an act of Congress before they could change the code.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So there are all kinds of stories. And there's still stories that get, maybe not as well known as those.
Yeah.
But there's many stories. But you're right. When I started out software development, I did everything. I did the analysis, I did the design, I did the coding, I did the testing, and I did the client interface. Yep. And nobody was looking over my shoulder.
Yep. Yeah, you could write a lot of code before anyone ever saw it. Sometimes nobody saw it. There were times I would write stuff, and this was even early 2000s, where I would write things and maybe I'd have a peer review, but not all the time.
One of the funniest little quips in the book was I was talking to Tom DeMarco, who's kind of the guru of structured development, one of them, and he was talking about when he was at Bell Labs I guess this was in the 70s. They were trying to figure out how to do better coding, and he said he actually ran across a program one time where the variable names were vegetables.
Yeah, I remember reading that passage. You also explained something for me too, because I worked in some Fortune 500s where, I don't know if most of the world knows this. We tell people all the time in classes, but a lot of the claims processing software that still runs today in companies that we all probably know of, and a lot of financial trading applications, they still run on COBOL code written in the 1970s.
Yep.
Because we encounter this with some of our clients. So it's out there. And it speaks to IBM's iSeries too. They still release updates for those things. So it's been a workhorse. Not easy to change, but you answered something for me that I have always, whenever I worked on an AS400 at when I was actually employed by a company, the variable names were always so cryptic and short. And you made this reference in the book that a lot of programmers who learned COBOL came from Fortran, which had I believe you said 6-character limit for variable names. And they just carried that practice over into COBOL.
Right.
So you'd have all these short variable names that weren't descriptive, right? They didn't make sense. Some people, pick fruits for variable names that are. So that made so much. I was like, oh, that makes so much sense now. Why I countered that over and over again when you'd sift through code.
And in those days, maintaining somebody else's code was just horrendous.
Yeah, the other cool thing, Jeff and I always talk about, back to you saying you did everything. I love the term full stack developer. I don't even know why we have to use it, because I think it's an indication that we took a turn for the worse, right? Where we started specializing. And I think you talk about this too, right? Where there's, you shouldn't have to wait weeks to months for a database change, right? There's a reason there's an alter statement. Like, just let us make the database changes. And my earlier jobs, I did do most everything. But then when I got into larger corporations, there was the database department, and there were architects.
Well, what happened?
It was harder to interface.
Right. What happened, of course, was that was a legacy of waterfall development.
Yep.
Because first of all, you separated the boxes, and then you specialized with people in each of those boxes, and then you communicated via documentation. And so the Agile movement was really not against documentation. It was for collaboration. And to say that you really needed to collaborate, and the documentation that you needed to record what you'd done during the collaboration was fine, but don't substitute. I was at a very large company in New Jersey one time, and the architects had just issued an enterprise architecture document that was supposed to carry them into the future. And so I went down to the development staff and I said, "What do you think of the new architecture document?" And they said, "Well, we don't understand it. We just put it on the shelf." And I went back to the architecture guys and said, how many meetings have you got set up to try to explain this architecture to the developers? And they said, "Well, none. It ought to be obvious."
Yep.
And it obviously wasn't.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I also related a lot to your project management stories. There's a phrase in your book that you say, I think it's in relationship essentially to a project can be, waterfall project can go wrong for months to years before you really discover, right? Because you don't have that agile feedback loop. And I had to highlight it because it just made me laugh so much about my past. But you can fake, here's your quote, "You can fake the completion of a requirements document, but you can't fake tested running code." And I just thought that phrase, like, there's so much into that one little sentence. Like, just think about the number of requirements documents that, the way you say it, have been faked around the world over the last several decades, because they don't mean anything. Yeah. If you can't translate it, if you can't understand it and turn it into action, it doesn't matter, right? And same thing with architecture, with requirements. So I don't know. That one made me laugh.
Yeah, I was doing another project with a company down in Arizona one time, and the architect said, it's going to take, he was really into UML. And so I said, "Well, how long will it take you to do the architecture work?" And he said, "Oh, about 3 months." And I said, "You have 2 weeks." Yep. He said, we're going to start in 2 weeks. And he grumbled and talked, but he had something together 2 weeks in. And so I asked him to make a presentation to the development people. So he did, and then I could see these blank stares. And so I asked the development people, I said, "Do you understand that?" They said, "No." Luckily, this architect could code. And so I sat him down and he showed him how he was going to code this, and the lights began to come on. And that's the kind of interaction that you've got to have. You can't do it just through documentation.
Yeah.
It's almost like architecture needs to be something that's facilitated nowadays instead of something that like one person has up in their ivory tower and then hands down to other people, right? I don't know if that's ever been the case where that worked well, but that's just, it's about getting shared understanding and alignment, right? Like that's what it really comes down to.
That's right. And you have the same thing between the requirements of design and programming and programming and testing. You have the same kind of issues.
Yep, exactly.
And that's really what the Agile Manifesto was speaking to. I've just continue to see people talk about the fact that Agile, advocates no documentation. And I saw that on a LinkedIn inquiry or post 3 or 4 months ago. And I wrote down, I said, "These were the same issues we were talking about in 2002. Can't you come up with something new?"
All right.
So, Jim, just kind of wrapping up here, like, is there one question that we didn't ask you that you wish we would have asked you?
Well, I'll talk about one thing here. The question would be, if you could rewrite the manifesto, how would you do different?
Okay.
And I think that there are some things that probably need some clarification. For example, there's been a misconception of the word over. Individuals and interactions over process and tools. It doesn't say instead of. It says over, which means that individuals and interactions are really, really important. Tools and processes are really important. But if you've got your choice, take the better people over better processes and tools any day, because the good people will excel in the face of having second tier tools, but the people with first level tools that don't know how to do requirements or do design or whatever are not going to fare very well.
Yep.
And so people have said to take that word out. And the answer to that for me is no, it deserves to be in there because it helps you differentiate. It helps you make decisions when you really get down to it. Is you going to try to put every little nickel and dime thing in the contract, or you're going to depend on close collaboration with your client?
Yep.
And if you try to put nickel and dime into your contract, you're going to end up in court, and it's not going to be good for any party. So work on the collaboration. So those are the kinds of things. I wouldn't rewrite the manifesto, but some of those things need to be continually kind of clarified because people tend to misinterpret them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
It's great.
So kind of as we're wrapping up here then, is there anything you want to plug to our listeners or promote other than your new book?
Not really, except I'm sort of beginning to challenge the new Agilist or the people that have come before and trying to say, why do you think the Agile movement has been so important for 20 plus years? What is it about the manifesto and what has happened after that? Why has it been so successful? Because there's no question, but it has been. And so if we're going to move forward, we have to answer the question, what do we keep? What endures? And what needs to change? And I think that Agile probably needs some extensions and some new things. I mean, for example, in the original manifesto, when XP people were working, they were only kind of hinting at DevOps. You know, they talked about integrations, but they really didn't talk about DevOps until several years later. And so those are the kinds of extensions to Agile that I think have kept it fresh.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of things we need to think about. How is AI going to help us be more agile? How is it going to promote agility rather than we need a new manifesto? I can tell you the 17 people that wrote it could never get together today and agree on anything.
That's probably why it hasn't changed, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think the way you even refer to that in the book is like, you know, I think, or you said, Agile has stood the test of time now that it's not just a fad, it's a trend. And I think it is going to, whether we change the word over the next 5 decades, if it really just comes down to dollars and cents, you have an organization, you're trying to move some cause, mission, purpose forward in the world. It just makes business sense to do it in the most adaptable, agile way you can, right? Like it. So I think it's just good business overall, but it is pretty remarkable. I mean, I'm sure for you especially, right? Because you hint like none of you could predict the future. Nobody knew how big some of these frameworks and the word was going to be, and here we are, and it's like there's job titles with the word agile in it everywhere around the world, right? There's millions of people around the world who are speaking this language and still, which is also speaking to the trend, discovering it for the first time yet 2 decades later.
Right.
So it's awesome.
And with something that is that widespread, I always go back to Jerry Weinberg's law of raspberry jam, which is the further you spread it, the thinner it gets. So it's kind of thin out there on the edges. And so, what we're looking to the new generation for, and what I see coming along, are people that are beginning to make it thicker again. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I love it.
If you found value in today's episode, share this with a friend. Until next time, get agile and stay agile.